During Nintendo's 2014 E3 presentation, 3.5 years after the release of Skyward Sword, they announced a new Zelda game, one that looked very different compared to anything we've seen before. Link himself was sporting a completely different outfit than what he usually wears, and was using strange arrows against a robotic spider of some kind. It left us with no idea of how it would play or even its name, just a release date of 2015. As a longtime fan of the series, I and many others were really excited about the game, and were also equally intrigued with how different it looked. A couple delays and 2 years later, this Zelda was revealed to be open world, with many new gameplay elements the likes of which the series had never seen before. And finally, we knew the game's name, Breath of the Wild. A release date was finally given during Nintendo's presentation announcing the Switch, where the game was revealed to be coming out as the console's launch title on March 3rd. After a few months, it came out to mass critical acclaim and would go on to become what's currently the best-selling game in the series. In less than 2 months from now, we'll get to play the sequel to one of my favorite open-world experiences ever made, Tears of the Kingdom. As you can easily imagine, I'm pretty excited about it, so I figured, hey, why not go ahead and give myself a not-so-quick refresh by revisiting both this and Age of Calamity. Breath of the Wild was an amazing time for me when I first played it in 2017. The game certainly wasn't perfect, but for the first open-world Zelda, I think it did an incredible job as a first attempt. I haven't played through it in a good long while, so I'll be interested to see if my thoughts on the game have changed at all. So let's go ahead and dive into the Switch's incredible Day 1 launch title. This time around, the world of Hyrule is very different than what it usually is, where it would normally start with Link waking up to a quiet life in a peaceful village of some kind. Here, he's instead met with a Hyrule that was brought to its knees more than 100 years ago by Calamity Ganon, an incarnation of the Demon King that's threatened Hyrule time and time again. 100 years prior, the royal family of Hyrule sought out ancient relics built by the Sheikah tribe 10,000 years ago to help fight back against Calamity Ganon. These relics were the army of autonomous robots called Guardians and the 4 divine beasts. Calamity Ganon, having dealt with this before, came prepared and instead corrupted them and turned them against the kingdom. These events managed to gravely injure the hero and forced Zelda to seal the Calamity in Hyrule Castle for a century while Link recovered in the Shrine of Resurrection. Even 100 years later, the scars that Calamity left can still be felt throughout the entire world. Where once there were towns and villages are now only ruins being taken back by nature. The many monsters serving Ganon are a constant problem because even if they're killed, they'll always come back to life after the next blood moon. And the castle in the center of Hyrule serves as a reminder not only for what happened so long ago, but also that the seal holding back the Calamity can hold forever, and eventually Ganon will be released. There's a lot to see and experience in Breath of the Wild's post-Calamity Hyrule. It's a world that radiates history, with every part of the map having some little detail to think about, or some story to tell, like the giant laser-shaped hole in Hebra Peak, or the Fire Whiz rope dancing around the burned remains of a house. It may not have much of an emphasis on overt storytelling, which is a common and fair criticism, but I've never seen another open-world game have as much to say with its environment as Breath of the Wild does. Even 6 years later, there's still this magical feeling in exploring Hyrule. There's always some interesting landmark off in the distance, or some small detail that can catch your eye. There is genuinely nothing I love doing more in this game than paragliding off of a high cliff and just taking in everything around me. It's a beautiful feeling that I've only ever felt in one other game before, with that being my favorite open world game, Xenoblade X. That being said though, like I just mentioned a bit ago, one of the more common criticisms for the game is a lack of an overall story. While Breath of the Wild certainly isn't devoid of one, it's definitely lacking in this area. The biggest reason really is just because the game's story happened 100 years ago. The present is basically just cleaning up after the mess the Calamity created. Beyond what is already in the game, there's not much more to tell. Credit where it's due though, this game does have my favorite version of Zelda, with Breath of the Wild's being a pretty great character. Frankly, her being a massive nerd is just super endearing. For me, I think the lack of story does work for Breath of the Wild. The game's major focus was on the adventure itself, and exploring Hyrule, and for the first open-world Zelda, I personally think it's fine if it's a bit lacking just this once. As an experience, I think Breath of the Wild manages to perfectly accomplish what it set out to do. As a game though, while very good, it definitely has a lot of room for improvement. To this day, I've never seen another open-world game give the player nearly as much freedom as Breath of the Wild does in every aspect of its gameplay. The game starts out restrictive with you stuck in the Great Plateau until you learn the basics and you get all 4 runes. Once you've accomplished that and have the paraglider though, the world is free for you to explore at your will and do whatever objectives you want in any order. If you want to try completing the game to the best of your ability, or even get the Master Sword before the first dungeon, you absolutely can. The game is more than content with that. Heck, you don't even have to do any of that at all if you don't want to. Once you're off the plateau, you can go ahead and rush to the final boss if you want. This freedom also extends to my favorite thing to find in Breath of the Wild with the shrines, a series of 120 mini-dungeons scattered around Hyrule that were created by the Sheikah that reward you with spirit orbs you can use to increase your health or stamina once you get 4. In the shrine, Link has 4 runes in the Sheikah slate he can use to help solve puzzles, the Zelda staple of bombs, magnesis, stasis, and cryonis. Bombs come in both a sphere and square shape that do exactly what you think they would. Magnesis lets Link move around any metal object within range, and Stasis can stop an object in place, and if hit, allows it to build up kinetic energy to launch in that direction. Cryonis can spawn ice pillars you can climb on, but they're really only super useful in shrines. Since you can only create them on bodies of water, I didn't use them too much, but it's good to have if you need to cross a watery gap and you don't have the stamina to swim over it. The shrines themselves are one of my favorite aspects of the game. Zelda dungeons are always the best part of these games for me, so having a massive collection of little mini-dungeons to find in the environment was fantastic. Going through the game, there's a pretty good chance you'll solve a shrine and wonder whether or not you even solved it in the intended way or not. For one of the Gerudo Desert shrines, instead of only using just the metal boxes to connect the electrical current to shrine gates, I instead also used metal weapons to make the puzzle easier to solve, and that's just one example. I can guarantee you there's tons more. As for some of the more unique shrines, Typhlo Ruins is pretty memorable for me. Not just because it's really unique, but because I'm someone who's incredibly freaked out by complete darkness in games, so this was, and still is, incredibly terrifying. To be honest, I've never been more grateful for the lack of re-deads in a Zelda game before, because we all know the devs of Nintendo would have placed them here if they were. Eventide Island is easily the most unique trial in the game, with it taking your equipment away and needing to gather from the land in order to get the 3 spheres on the island. With the exception of the gyro-controlled apparatus shrines, I also really enjoyed most of the puzzle-based shrines. Unfortunately though, this is where we have to get into some of Breath of the Wild's many growing pains. The biggest problem with the shrines is their presentation. The ancient Sheikah aesthetic was really nice at first with how serene and otherworldly it felt, but it does get a bit old after going through over 100 of these things. Another issue I have is with the Test of Strength shrines. These always have you fighting one of 3 tiered Guardian Scouts, and I really wish there were different kinds of enemies you could fight here, like perhaps a Sheikah version of a Dark Nut or Iron Knuckle. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it might be to the game's benefit to expand on the shrine concept as a whole, because one thing I noticed during this playthrough is how many tests of strength and blessing shrines there actually were. The blessing shrines are one where you'll usually have to do a shrine quest in order to discover or get access to. Some are good, like the 3 Lome Labyrinths. In other cases, though, it's possible you'll find the shrine all without even accepting the quest. From what I've seen, close to half of all shrines in the game are either blessings or tests of strength, and it makes me think that the devs were having some trouble coming up with over 100 unique mini-dungeons during development using only the 4 major tools they gave Link. While I think the amount of puzzles we were given using just the 4 runes in the game's amazing physics engine is incredible, I feel there's a lot of room for improvement here. On the note of improvements though, let's talk about probably the biggest and the most common criticism against Breath of the Wild: the weapons and durability. A lot of people find it annoying how easily Breath of the Wild's weapons break, and while I can easily see why, I have a different issue with it than most do. For me, I just find it ridiculous how quickly they break. Like, I get the idea behind the system. It's to encourage people to use different weapons, and that's fine. But did they need to break this fast? If you have, let's say, 15 weapons and you're fighting enemies non-stop, you'll probably break all of them in, at best, 40-ish minutes. Honestly, I also just think it's the least interesting way you could handle weapons like this in an open-world Zelda game. Like, your melee weapons are functionally just really short-ranged ammunition, and that just doesn't really feel right. I think the weapon breaking system can work, but it's gotta be toned down a lot. Like, I don't think it's unfair to say that I really should be going through weapons at like 1/5 the time in Tears of the Kingdom. Switching to a different topic though, let's talk about the biggest problem I have with this game's exploration, and probably most people's biggest problem with it: the rain. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat or try to defend this. The rain in Breath of the Wild is one of the most frustrating things I've seen in an open world game. I get what the devs were going for here, but the execution just makes the whole thing obnoxious. Like, look at this, I'm trying to climb up this wall to get to a shrine, but I physically can't make it to the top because it's raining. If I want to find this shrine, I literally have no other choice but to find a longer alternate route. Look, if this sort of thing has to come back in the next game, there really needs to be an upgrade of some kind that alleviates the issue, like some kind of special climbing gear you can find as an optional upgrade. Actually, better idea, they could just say that Link's new super hand he gets in Tears of the Kingdom just gives him the grip strength to climb in the rain. People would buy that explanation. There are other little things I think the game could have done better with, like the enemies, since despite how good the one we have are, there's a shocking lack of them, or even the game's arguably weird difficulty curve. But instead of going deeper into those, I think I'd rather move on to my biggest problem with the game as well as easily its weakest aspect, the very underwhelming divine beasts. The divine beasts are probably the only aspect of this game I would describe as disappointing, and as someone who absolutely loves the dungeons in Zelda, this really hurts to say. Credit where it's due though, the quest lines leading up to them were very good, and I don't really have any criticisms with this aspect of the divine beasts. Well, unless you're Vomado, whose build-up is weirdly short compared to the others. I even really liked all the fights with the divine beasts. In many respects, they kinda feel like cool boss fights in their own right. The actual problem with them unfortunately comes from the dungeons themselves. Unlike past entries, the divine beasts are much smaller and have a stronger emphasis on puzzles than combat, with you taking advantage of the various runes you got at the start of the game to solve them. You'll also be solving puzzles by taking advantage of each divine beast's map mechanic, to manipulate them in a few different ways, like changing Vomado's flight angle to make things move a certain direction. Breath of the Wild does use all of its mechanics in fun enough ways, but the big issue here is that the divine beasts don't feel like dungeons. And I'm not saying this because they're not like the old style at all. In fact, I love the core design philosophy behind them, even if I think it could use a bit of tweaking. The divine beasts are all about giving the player the freedom to solve problems in any way they want, and I think Breath of the Wild's style of puzzles combined with the mechanics at the player's disposal has a lot of potential for creating some genuinely incredible dungeons. But the divine beasts feel more like big shrines than actual dungeons. They're much smaller in comparison and are on average shorter as well. Visually speaking, they all share a similar aesthetic to the game's many shrines, and while they do all look great, it does still get really tiring after a while. The puzzles themselves didn't exactly help either. Sure, they were fun, but it felt too much like something I'd find in a shrine. And while I think Va Ruta's mechanic involving its trunk and Va Naboris' multi-chambered stomach are interesting, the other two don't really compare for me. Vomado and Va Rudania have a very similar mechanic, with them just moving to a different angle. It's cool once, but with half of the divine beasts sharing the same base idea for how you manipulate them, it loses its uniqueness. Heck, beyond the puzzles, your major goal for progressing is also the same for each shrine. Activate the 5 terminals scattered throughout the divine beast, and then the main one to fight the boss. On the note of said bosses though, the Blight Ganons all feel too similar to each other. Sure, they don't fight exactly the same, but with how similar they look, it's hard to see them as anything other than the same guy but with a different weapon. To be honest, the only Ganon Blight whose fight I thoroughly enjoyed was Thunderblight Ganon. Not for its difficulty, but rather for having the most interesting fight, with him being able to easily speed blitz you, and his second phase where you need to use Magnesis to shock him out of the air. My biggest hope for Tears of the Kingdom is that it can give the dungeons more of a proper identity, because I feel like that's something the divine beasts just strangely lack. Credit where it's due though, the game's final dungeon Hyrule Castle and the game's DLC dungeon in the Champion's Ballad, The Final Trial, were actually pretty good. Hyrule Castle has so many different ways you can go about making your way to Ganon, it's kinda crazy. You can storm the front gate, take the back way and skip all of it, or you can even go in from the side. It perfectly reflects the level of freedom Breath of the Wild gives you, and there's plenty of things to find in it, like really powerful weapons and even the Hylian shield. It's also great to have a dungeon heavier on combat after so much puzzle solving from the many shrines and the divine beasts. I will say though, I almost feel like it gives you too much freedom since, like I said earlier, you really can just skip like 90% of it by taking the back way. The game's DLC dungeon, The Final Trial, still has the length and aesthetic problem I have with the divine beasts, but mechanically it's a lot better. The puzzles involving the use of the giant central wheel were pretty creative and easily my favorite ones in the whole game. Heck, The Final Trial also uses the terminals better, with them being used to remove locks in a giant door so the central wheel can open it. Monk Mas Koshia is also the best boss in the game, with him having a great variety of attacks to use, and the moment he stood up from his meditation being pretty memorable for me, especially after seeing every other monk just fade away. I also gotta say, the Master Cycle 0 is a really cool reward for the dungeon, and it's so fun to use it makes me wish I could have had this the entire game. As a whole though, even with these last 2 dungeons, I still wasn't totally satisfied. The rest of the game was great despite the issues I had with it, but the dungeons generally just leave a lot to be desired for me. Breath of the Wild is a fantastic experience. It single-handedly ignited my love for open-world games with how wonderfully crafted the world is, and how fun it is to explore Hyrule. But as a game that's transitioning into something mechanically very new and different for the series, it's certainly got some growing pains and things it could do better. And you know what? I think that's what has me so excited about Tears of the Kingdom. Breath of the Wild is a game you look at and go, you know what, this was great, but I'm sure whatever comes next will be even better. This game is already incredible for me, so the idea that Tears of the Kingdom could improve on what was set up here is a pretty exciting feeling, and I can't wait for it to come out. Before that though, we've got one more game to look at with the prequel game that surprised probably everyone, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.